This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The curtain has come down on 2022. It has been a year of mixed outcomes, some good, others not so good. Once again, the economy and particularly its impact on the cost of living was and still is a source of concern. A peace deal over Tigray, an escalation in DR Congo, sporadic coups in West Africa, terror attacks in Mogadishu and a volatile Sahel define the peace and security front. But a smooth transition in Kenya's politics, continuity in Angola and a key outcome at COP27 lit up an otherwise tumultuous year. So this week on the program, we walk you back on the year that was 2022. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And we have a lot to unpack. Let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining us from Johannesburg, Professor David Monyae, International Relations and Foreign Policy Expert. Joining us via Zoom from Enugu in Nigeria, Dr. Ifediora Chimezi Amobi, an economist. And in London, also joining us via Zoom, Dr. Andrew Yao-Chie, Senior Fellow, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all. First of all, Africa has entered 2022 with a long and urgent to-do list. Before we look at specifics, I want to get your assessment and thoughts on the trends that you feel shaped Africa in 2022. What were some of the issues that stood out for you and which you feel had an effect on Africa this year? Let me start off with you, Dr. Yao-Chie.
Thank you very much. I think one of the first things that has been top of the agenda this year has been the issue of climate change and the impact on climate and security. That is by far probably one of the biggest things that have been talked about this year, but also as we see some of the challenges across the continent have been exacerbated by this. Second thing is really terrorism. And the impact that terrorism is having across particularly border areas, and this could be the Lake Chad Basin, the Sahel, and other regions. And then instability when it comes to constitutional changes that are ongoing, but also transitional governments. So this idea of transitional governments that have agreements that are put in place, oftentimes from coups, as we see particularly in West Africa, but actually these agreements that oftentimes don't lead to the fulfillment of the agreements or the stipulations within the agreement themselves. And sort of the fifth thing, and not to say that it's limited to five, there are several, obviously, and other speakers will pick them up, particularly around the economy. And I'm thinking of from Ghana, where I'm from, where we now see a 50% inflation. But the fifth thing, which I think is important to talk about, is the issue of cross-border challenges. Really what you're seeing in cross-border and the movement of people, migration, continue to be an issue, but also we're seeing African states trying to find more ways of integrating these challenges. And what I mean by integrating, ways in which the nations and the leaders can find ways of being able to allow for cross-flow of migration because of challenges that we're seeing arising from various parts of the continent as well.
All right, Dr. Amobi, let me get your view.
Yeah, thank you very much. In addition to what he has said, in 2022, Africa has come a very, very long way. We are actually, we're yet to recover from a lot of the ills that have actually happened everywhere from socioeconomic declines to droughts, to flooding, migration issues, cross-border conflicts, like you said, all those things. And then just to add all that, one of the key things that have actually shaped the continent this year has been the crisis in the Ukraine. Africa has been very, very dependent on Russia as well as Ukraine, which especially in terms of food, grain, fuel, etc. That goes through Europe. And this has affected the continent. We've seen prices escalate because of high gas prices in Europe, which has affected, even my country here in Nigeria. I mean, we're a major oil producer, but a lot of our, finished crude oil is actually imported. So we export crude. It is refined overseas and then brought back in as as raw petroleum. And so, we pay a very, very high price for that. And we have seen diesel and kerosene and, aviation fuel prices, etc., more than quadruple in 2022. And so it has actually affected everything else around the economy. And, going into the elections early next year, it is a big, big, big political issue and will affect the decisions that people are going to make going forward.
Right. Professor Munyai, what's your view?
I concur with my two colleagues. In addition, I think when it comes silencing the gun, one of the major agenda of the AE, I think we have seen an increase in that regard. With the crisis in Africa's political capital itself, crisis in Ethiopia, in terms of the conflict and possible peace that was brokered here in South Africa. We also have seen tensions in Mozambique increasing, threatening the region, as well as in the Great Lake region with the M23, the destabilization and all issues that are raised that Rwanda is supporting the M23. So these are some of the issue in addition to endless coups that we've seen mainly in West Africa, North Africa. But beyond that, we also have seen an increase in terms of attraction of the continent by big powers. Other than China, we've seen the United States coming quite big, designing a strategy for the continent around August, and the visit by the Secretary of State Blinken to a number of African capitals, including Pretoria. But there has also been other smaller powers in the Arab world that has been involved in Africa. And it has been a mixed bag, good and bad, given the fact that we still suffer from the hangover of the COVID-19.
All right. So, Dr. Amobe, I want to come back with one of the issues you've mentioned here, and that is the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which has dominated the world focus for all of 2022, let's say. And many in Africa are wondering what the long-term geopolitical implications of this crisis will be on Africa. What's your view?
Well, I think it's going to be devastating. What it actually portends is that as the rest of the world enters into the winter months, heating oil prices are going to really escalate, which will translate down here in Africa, whereby, we're currently experiencing, massive price shocks.
Right.
I've mentioned, fuel and food. And so, the whole value chain, transportation costs, bringing these things down to the various countries, most especially the poor areas, having the people there not be able to afford, a lot of these items, which is now leading to massive insecurity across the continent. What are we going to see as a potential? Mm-hmm. It is not going to be eased up very, very soon. I foresee more of this going on at least into the early part of next year, into the first quarter of next year. So our political development is really going to be, hampered until that is resolved.
Professor Munyai, I want to come back to the Ukraine-Russia conflict here and find out from your view, though. How did Africa react, though, to this? How did Africa deal with the situation, and how do you see Africa dealing with this moving forward?
I think one major lesson coming out of the Ukraine crisis has been the pressure exerted on the continent by the United States and Western powers. And equally, we have seen a pushback by some African countries to bring a situation in which what appears as if it's a division, that a bulk of African countries voted for certain resolution while others are pushed back, went for neutrality or non-aligned positions. And that, I think, for the very first time, I think at the geopolitical level, we see Africa asserting itself. And this has extended to other issues and questions asked involvement of the continent, for instance, in G20, with the possibility of the AU getting a seat in addition to what South Africa has. Therefore, the continent might have 2 seats within G20, and more questions are asked about the United Nations Security Council and other important institutions of global governance. To what extent can Africa democratize these institutions and legitimize them, ensure that decisions that are taken at the global level involves Africans, with Africans in the room?
Right. Dr. Amobi, let me come back to you very briefly on the inflation that we saw across the continent, because globally, people are experiencing inflation at levels not seen for decades. Africa also faced a slow recovery from the pandemic. So what has this meant for Africa in 2022? What kind of disruptions did African economies suffer?
Very, very significant ones. Inflation in most African countries actually, almost doubled, and we saw figures, across the continent. The global pandemic was devastating, economy-wise, inflation-wise. People were also displaced from the workplace. The lockdown affected, farms and farmers, women that, subsistence providers for their families. Luckily, there's been, what I would actually refer to as a quick recovery in some parts of Africa. South Africa, that was hit more than the rest of the continent, is still recovering, but has actually made significant progress, just like other parts of the continent. We were, particularly, for lack of a better word, lucky here in Africa that the disaster that we actually expected from the pandemic wasn't as bad as a lot of the pundits had actually, thought it was going to be. And so, yes, we experienced an increase in all indicators, inflation, unemployment, displacements, like I said, output, most especially.
Right.
How is it going to affect us going forward? It's going to be a gradual recovery. We're going to have to match it with all the other ills that we're experiencing at the moment, the conflicts across our borders. And of course, we just talked about the war in Ukraine. There's some other ills, there's security, there's insurgency, there's terrorism, there are religious conflicts, all these things will, just translate into a slow but steady and sure recovery going forward. Right.
So, Dr. Yao Chi, I want to stay on that conflict issue that Dr. Amobi has just mentioned, because it's been a mixed bag for the continent. The Ethiopian government and the TPLF signed an agreement to put an end to the 2-year civil war. But, the world's longest running conflict, on the other hand, in the DRC continues. The Sahel region remains unstable. How do you see the AU having fared here? How did Africa fare?
I think when it comes to these conflicts, I think the continent has done its best to adjust. And what I mean best, as we've seen an African-led mediation team go in, particularly former President Obasanjo lead the way to try and bring the parties together. And that is a good thing. We should celebrate it, despite what pundits have said. I think we are seeing efforts, particularly in the Great Lakes, to resolve the issue. We see that the East African forces being deployed there. I would argue that the challenge here, though, is that while there's a tendency for the African continent to deploy military force as the first result, we should be looking and investing more in mediation and preventative diplomacy. And I think this is one of the things that I would like to see happening, particularly from the AU. I know it's restructuring, or it's going through a restructuring process, but some of this would be good to see more preventative diplomacy, but again, mediating. And I know it has played a role and continues to play a role, but particularly with the RECs, the regional bodies, how can these two partnerships be strengthened, enhanced, to be able to deal and rectify, and in essence, to avoid or divert some of these challenges that the African continent in these regions have. But I would say this, I think it's also important while we have these challenges that we also, as Africans, admit some of the challenges that we have. We do elect these officials in. And so if we have these challenges, then we also, and I would argue, we need to think about the people that we're electing. Who are these people that we're putting in leadership positions? Are they the right people for the jobs? And if they're not, then what are the alternatives that we have for us, for the continent, but also for the types of leadership that we want, in essence, going forward?
All right. So, Professor Munyai, we've seen a lot of re-entry of some other major powers, as you mentioned there earlier. You talked a little bit about the geopolitics and what's been happening on the continent. So what have been the interests and objectives, though, for Europe, the United States and China in Africa in this regard?
I think what we've seen, tensions among big powers with the US and Western countries, particularly Europe, ganging, and for the lack of a better term, ganging against Russia and China as far as the African continent is concerned, making really serious threats that Africans should not do business with these two countries. And there has been a pushback from the African continent that the continent does not need a supervisor, someone to supervise the relation that the continent will have with other external role players. And therefore, I think we see an increase in terms of the minerals that my colleagues have been mentioning, core and strategic minerals that we have as we move into green clean energy. I think you see more of that taking place. It's a kind of an emerging Cold War. However, this needs the continent to unite, speak with one voice, and indeed have a strong leadership. The bigger question is, this is the second time they go to Washington. Why shouldn't the US leadership come to the continent? Why should we go to every power that calls leaders, African leaders? Should we go to all these places, or we should use our own capitals to hold some of these important meetings?
All right, gentlemen, we are going to take a short break on that note. And when we come back, we will look at Africa's take away from COP27 and whether there is reason to be optimistic on the climate front. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me on the program, joining from Johannesburg, Professor David Munyai, International Relations and Foreign Policy Expert. In Enugu in Nigeria, Dr. Ifediora Chimezi Amobi, he's an economist. And in Abuja, Ifeoma Malo, founder, Clean Technology Hub. Well, let me start off with you, Ifeoma, because the Africa COP took place in Egypt. Now, Africa loses between 5% to 15% of its GDP to climate change, according to climate statistics. Was COP27 a net positive or negative for the continent?
Some people would argue that there's a net positive. Others would say that, there were lots of things that happened at this COP that were not a benefit to the continent. But let me start with a few of the positives. I think the historic creation of a loss and damage fund to support communities whose lives and livelihoods have been damaged or ruined by the worst impacts of climate change was a definite positive. That deal almost didn't get made. And we didn't get everything that we asked for in the loss and damage fund. But the fact that it went through and there were commitments that were put into that fund already is a plus. There were also African-led initiatives to cut emissions and build climate resilience. And then there was significant work on the mobilization of finance. We could see that in the commitments made by the AFDB, and there was one by the Africa 59 and other partners who launched the African Green Infrastructure Alliance, the AGIA. which is an alliance to create and catalyze capital to address climate challenges on the continent. And then lastly, you had the UN Secretary General announce the $3.1 billion funding to ensure that there is a protection of planet and people and building early warning systems in the next 5 years. Now, the challenge is how, African countries are going to leverage this financing, because it's not the first time that we've had announcements around big funds being dedicated to climate financing. We had a lot of commitments in past COPs, and we haven't seen that money. And so the question and the challenge a lot of people are asking is, well, it's great that all of these commitments were made, but then how then do we make sure that there is ability to leverage that finance and bring it onto the continent, not have it remain in Western countries, and use that to actually do a lot of the adaptation and mitigation work that needs to go on the continent.
Well, if you've mentioned the loss and damages being one of the key victories at the COP27. What exactly will this mean for Africa? I mean, how much of a game changer is the facility on loss and damage?
First of all, even the notion of getting Western countries to agree to something that is akin to a reparation fund is huge. You've not had that in the past. You've had a lot of, buck passing when it comes to trying to think about the people or the countries who are the greatest emitters or polluters when it comes to climate and what they need to do about it. One part of it is actually getting them to accept responsibility, which is what this loss and damage fund is. The second is actually getting them to put some money into ensuring that there is now mitigation for those countries who are bearing the impact of those climate disasters. And Africa, all of the data and all of the indices shows that Africa is bearing the brunt of the climate challenges. So this is why it's not surprising that we had a lot of the European countries announcing a total of 105 million in new funding. You had Denmark, Finland, Belgium, Ireland, coming together and putting together this global environment facility funds to target the immediate climate adaptation for low-income countries, which mainly are sub-Saharan African countries. So it's a huge game changer for Africa.
All right. So there's a lot that happened on the continent in 2022. Professor Monyae, the biggest political event of the year happened in China, the CPC National Congress. What were the important political outcomes here, and how do you see some of those decisions having a bearing on Africa?
The CPC 20th Congress, I think, was a landmark. I think it has given the world, and Africa in particular, a clear signal in terms of which direction is President Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is taking the country, and the contribution that China is going to play at the world stage. I think for me, what stood out were two major concepts introduced by President Xi Jinping, namely the Global Development Initiative, as well as Global Security Initiative. These are important concepts that align with what Africa is talking about when we talk within the AU, Agenda 2063, for instance, as well as within the Global South, strengthening multilateralism, as well as understanding fully that one cannot talk about development in the absence of security. And the two are two sides of the same coin. And therefore, I think China's contribution will be significant in this regard.
And if we continue on that thought, Professor Monyae, China has systematically increased its involvement in Africa for over 20 years now. The U.S., as we've talked about earlier, has held a U.S.-Africa summit this year to expound primarily on its U.S.-Africa policy. So what have been the discernible different styles from what you can see, the styles of engagement between China and Africa and the U.S. and Africa?
Firstly, it has to do with the narratives. One, it seemed to me the United States tend to talk to or talk down to Africans in terms of you must do this, and also an element of preaching. You must adopt our way of life. and without really giving Africans a chance to contribute to the whole notion of democracy. As it stands, democracy is threatened even in the Western countries, particularly the United States itself. I think we've seen disturbances in so many areas within the US.
Right.
However, the Washington tend to preach to Africans on these issues, while China, on the other hand, tend to take a much more collective discussions without interfering in the domestic affairs of African countries. And therefore, I think there's a huge gap between Washington and Beijing as to how they approach the continent.
All right. So I want to get your thoughts here on when you look back in 2022, because we've had a lot of discussion here on what Africa did in 2022. But what do you think Africa should have focused on but failed to in 2022? Do you think Africa has ended 2022 on a high or on a low? Let me start off with you, Ifeoma.
One of the things that has happened is this conversation around just transition and energy transition. That conversation was going on before the Ukraine war, the Ukraine-Russia war, but has now been amplified because of Africa's place in that war. The whole battle for gas supply, the whole issue around energy insecurity and countries now deciding to go back on commitments they've made, not to open up new coal mines or new gas fields, have a reverberating effect on sub-Saharan Africa. They said that we're going to reduce emissions, but now we are now seeing people go back to those commitments, and that means we now have to now start exploring our own gas supplies. I think there should have been a bit more thought about that, but I think now that we're doing it, it's showing that, we have to sort of put our own interests first before the considerations of other countries.
Dr. Amobi, the economies have suffered massively in 2022. What do you think Africa should have focused on but did not?
Africa should focus more on education, more on capacity building. We can't afford to just worry about our stomachs and what we're going to eat and, shelter. Those things are basic. We should start thinking beyond basic. We have to train our people. Given that about 70% of Africa's population are classified as poor, and we've had this trend for the past 30 years, we should start thinking, 30 years from now, going forward, where is the next, group of children? How are we going to actually prepare them to take over the continent? And they have to be educated. We have to find ways of really breaking the cycle of poverty, cycle of dependency, cycle of desolation, etc.
All right. Professor Munyai, you have the final word.
I think there are core set of issues that need to be tackled. One is the unity among Africans around the Agenda 2063. Concentrate on issues of peace, negotiations in terms of dealing with the conflicts on the continent, and speed up the process of regional integration through infrastructure development, and ensure that we speak to the outside world with one voice, understanding what are priority areas for the continent and who are really our friends, and do we advance our own interests as we enter into relationship with strategic partners such as China, your Germany, your Japan, and the United States. We can't just be pulled to all directions. We need to advance our own interests instead of being preached upon.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Well, that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. Joining us from Johannesburg, Professor David Munyai, International Relations and Foreign Policy Expert. Joining us from Enugu in Nigeria via Zoom, Dr. Ifediora Chimezi Amobi, an economist. And also joining us from Abuja, Ifeoma Malo, founder, Clean Technology Hub. In London, also joining us via Zoom, Dr. Andrew Yauchie, Senior Fellow, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next time for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, Happy New Year.